this one's becoming more pronounced now. You read it more in conservative literature. The loss of fear of God and of eternal punishment. Many of us still had a foot in another generation, and a lot of people went to church on Sunday for this reason. That bluntly put, we went to church on Sunday because if you didn't, it was a mortal sin. And if you died during the week, you could go to hell. It was that deeply instilled in us, But that's completely disappeared. Why, just completely disappeared as an ethos in our culture. And my nephews and nieces, they're good people. They weren't raised like that. They have no concept of that, So that just the loss of fear of God, and and the loss of fear of hellfire, and the concept of mortal sin. Then, fourthly, the loss of the sense of extra ecclesia nulla salus. That's a very famous coinage by Cyprian of Carthage, which was misunderstood through history, because Cyprian of Carthage didn't mean it the way we've interpreted in Roman Catholicism for about 1700 years. Basically, that's Latin for outside of the church, there is no salvation. So we went through about 1700 years of Roman Catholicism, really up until Vatican II, that really gave, it wasn't so much it wasn't officially dogmatic. In fact, the opposite. You could be called a heretic for teaching this strictly, as was our man Feeney in Boston, Remember, Feeney, the priest in Boston, who had to fight there with, who was your cardinal there? The colorful guy. Cushing, And remember, Cushing's sister was married to a Jew, and Cushing was really, really close to this guy. But anyway, Feeney was teaching publicly that if you weren't a baptized Roman Catholic, you couldn't go to heaven. So Cushing tried to make him retract it, and he wouldn't. Cushing went to Rome and forced him to excommunicate this guy, because that is officially a Catholic heresy, But we lived that Catholic heresy for 1700 years with the true belief that if you weren't a Roman Catholic, or if you were a Roman Catholic and left the church, there wasn't going to be any salvation for you, That was right up into my generation. That's how I was catechized as a kid, Well, that'll keep you going to church, That isn't there anymore today, okay? But again, conservatives are saying because we let that go, no wonder people aren't going to church. It ties to the fear of God thing. Then the last one is the loss of a genuine sense of self-sacrifice of one's life for another. The most articulate voice in this is Cardinal George in Chicago, and he has done some very articulate stuff. And then Cardinal George says, what's wrong with our culture? He said, we've lost that. We have lost the sense that the church, your family, your country, somebody can ask for your life, and you got to give it. See, in the church, you used to be able to ask people, I want your life. Doesn't matter whether you're married or a celibate or a priest or a sister. You got to give your life to the nation. He said that's what's broken down in our culture, and ecclesiology will suffer in that climate. Okay, those are the conservatives. Now, liberals. Okay, and you'll recognize the same as you recognize all of these. None of this is new. Okay, the patriarchal nature of the Roman Catholic Church is seen most clearly in the sexual abuse crisis. So a lot of liberals today in the church struggle deeply, deeply with that, And in exit interviews, when they actually talk to Roman Catholics leaving the church, not just, I believe but I don't belong, but who say, I no longer go to a Catholic church, many of them will give you this reason. They'll say the church is compromised, it's patriarchal, that the sexual abuse crisis is simply, it reveals what's been there, and so on. Okay. Secondly, the triumph of fear in the church. I have liberal friends, some who still go to church, some who don't, and they say today, fear is trumping everything. That we are living so much, and not just also in society, the way we vote, everything else. It's just fear, and is the thing that drives it. And they say fear, as Jesus himself says, is the antithesis of religion. Remember, Jesus says, "Don't be afraid." Okay, the triumph of clericalism in the church, which liberals contend is making a huge, huge comeback. That is simply, it's always been there. It had some better years during the wake of Vatican II, but now it's re-entrenched and so on. No, I'm just laying out what they're saying. You can decide later on the truth of these things. The sense of the loss, and I want to quote Edward Skillebeck here. He took extra ecclesia nulla salus and he reversed it. He says, actually, the truth of the gospel is extra munda nulla salus, which means outside of the world there is no salvation. Okay, not outside of the church. And they say that the church has lost this. The church has simply lost the sense of extra munda nulla salus. Tell you what the way they say this. Because you know what the church has become? They say the church has become an instrument for the church, not an instrument to save the world. And so Jesus says, my flesh is food for the life of the world, but the church is saying, my flesh is food for the life of the church. And I have liberal friends that say you don't have to look any further for proof of this than the intentions in 98% of all Catholic churches every Sunday. You know, get after the homily, we say the creed. Now, this is supposed to be a mass for the world. What will always be the first petition? For the Pope. And then for the bishop, and then for this, and then later on, you may get the poor and so on, after Aunt Martha's arthritis and a few things and so on. But see, it sounded too much. It's about, the church is about the church. They said, no, what the church is about. The church is an instrument for the salvation of the world. The church is too narrow, too exclusive, too self-righteous, too un-Catholic, because Catholic means universal embrace, and too immature to be worthy of Jesus. They say the church today is simply not offering a model for human maturity. It's offering a model for certain kinds of obediences and so on, but not a model for human maturity. Okay, that's the liberal critique. Now, later on, I'll just, I'm gone tomorrow. You can debate these things back and forth. I'm just the weatherman tonight. I'm just reporting these things. Okay. Now, other perspectives. Okay. These are academic, and I hope you'll get them by the captions, okay? But if someone said to me, write an article and say why people aren't going to church, I would start from here down. Not because other things aren't important, they say something. The first one is what I call the Bibby-Parker thesis, or Palmer thesis. Reginald Bibby's Canada's foremost sociologist of religion. Parker Palmer is this wonderful Quaker writer here in the United States, now in his 70s. And their thesis would be that, you know why people aren't dropping away from, why they're dropping away from the church? It's the breakdown of public life, of family life, of community life, of neighborhood life. See, as Palmer says, we have three kinds of life. We have our intimacy, our life of intimacy. That's your friends, your family, and so on. Okay, those are the people you invite into your backyard for the barbecue. And then you have your civic life, Republicans, Democrats, who we vote for, and political parties. But in between, one of the most important features of life has always been the life of the neighborhood, the life of the parish. Notice the parish those aren't your intimates, and that isn't your civic life. That's just who you're dealt, like your neighbors. Boom, that's St. Monica's parish, from this street to that street, and you live with them. Today, people, we don't have neighborhoods. The public life is breaking down. And so it should be no surprise that parish life is breaking down. Parishioners are your neighbors. Nobody knows their neighbors anymore. We even build our houses to exclude them. Remember, if you look in old neighborhoods, you have a front porch, and everybody sits out at night. You socialize with neighbors. The kids play on the street. Today, you have a little bit of green on the front. Your house is roped off, and you have a high fence. And in the backyard, you bring your intimate people in. We don't have neighbors. We don't have neighborhood life. We don't have public life. Even the word pub is the English for a public house. And used to have one in England, Ireland, this place. You had a neighborhood recreation room in every parish. A lot of Irish parishes still have their own pub. It's like we should have. It's true. Today, those of you who are parish priests, you try this coffee and donuts after Mass. That is about as flat as a pancake. Why? Because first of all, nobody can have a donut anymore. You got to phone your health trainer and your doctor, calculate your calories for 3 weeks, and can this be done? And you got to make a couple of phone calls, and he says you can have a quarter of a donut and so on. And everybody's in a rush, and half of them can't take coffee and so on. So you have coffee and donuts. People stay for 5 minutes or 10 minutes twice a year to be polite. It doesn't work anymore. Okay, a pub might work. Have them come back Sunday night and watch the NFL football game together and drink beer, you know. See, but neighborhoods don't work. And so it's the death of public life. And that's Bibby's thing. He says people today treat their churches the way they treat their families and their neighbors, which means very, very selectively. Okay. Then, the Rahner-Nietzsche thesis. Okay. And Nietzsche said this 100 years ago. Rahner just put it into Christian terms, you know. Nietzsche's famous book, The Gay Science, that he wrote 150 years ago, now read here, 135 years ago. Nietzsche said, God is dead and is dying in the ordinary consciousness of the marketplace. Remember his famous image, which I based my book, The Shattered Lantern, on. The madman goes into the center of the town square and he smashes a lantern at high noon when the sun's out. And he said, God is dead and we're his murderers. He said, but I've announced it too soon. We don't know it yet. God will stay alive in the churches for another 60 years, but then God will slowly die. Why? Because God is, notice where where the madman smashes his lantern. Today we'd say in the mall, in the football stadium, where public life happens. See, Nietzsche 130 years ago said, God is dead in the ordinary consciousness of people. We still crank up God in our churches, but we don't. Our ordinary consciousness is agnostic, it's atheistic, you know. And we go to church and we become Christians for a few hours and so on. And Nietzsche said, once God dies in the churches, in the ordinary consciousness, he's going to die in the churches. That's his famous statement, God is dead. Rahner just put a much different, gentler spin to it, where he says that the transcendence is receding in secular consciousness. So it's almost like, that the sun is setting. You just see glimpses and so on, and but we're not drinking live from the springs anymore, because God isn't alive in ordinary consciousness. Okay, that's what Rahner meant when he says, the day will soon come when you'll either be a mystic or you'll be an unbeliever. What we meant by that is, see, the culture will no longer carry it for you. See, the culture won't carry the faith for you. You're going to have to carry it interiorly. In the past, the culture carried it for you. Our faculty right now together is reading a book by Charles Taylor, that monumental and I think magnificent book called A Secular Age, But Taylor shows how when you go back in history, there was a time, where it would have been impossible. It's virtually impossible to be an unbeliever, It's simply that the whole culture, carried belief. And how slowly through history, the default in Western history has come the other way. Okay, that's Rahner, Nietzsche. Then Philip Rieff and Ellen Bloom, who are two American philosophers of psychology and so on, they take a different take on it. They would say, what's happening? They said the closing of the American mind, the closing of Western mind. They say what's happening is our language and our symbols are being shrunken and shrunken and shrunken, so there's no room for any kind of transcendence or any kind of depth to them. Rieff has a take on it called the triumph of the therapeutic. Ellen Bloom would call it the triumph and the globalization of superficiality. So that's what we're doing. The globalization of superficiality. It's the loss of enchantment, and as Bloom says, very interesting from a secular writer, the loss of chastity. So they're saying, what's happening is, let me give you a simple example. They say, our symbols and our language are ever shrinking and leaving just less and less room for depth, for God, for meaning, and so on. And so they find that then we don't even have a language for that. Let me give you some examples. Excuse the crassness of this one, but it's clear. Bloom has it in his book. Bloom was a Neoplatonist, and I know he was a Christian, but he said, he says, I want to tell you what's happening. He says, I read Plato, and he says, Plato says, during their breaks, my students sit around and they tell marvelous stories about the meaning of their immortal longings. Marvelous stories about the meaning of their immortal longings. Bloom said, during their breaks, my students sit around and talk about being horny. He said, such is the difference. Notice a very kind of a different symbolic hedge. There's higher meaning, and you can trace, and scholars are doing that, they're tracing the language we use around love, around sex, around all kinds of things, and just see just how it's the symbolic hedge is coming down. Bloom, Reith traces that out a lot in what he calls the triumph of therapeutic. Let's give an example of this, and it's not that it's right or wrong; it's just the language you use. So, in Jesus' time, you go back to Scripture, okay? There were demons and angels everywhere. You didn't have a growing edge. You didn't have a neurosis. You were possessed. Now that's today nobody's possessed or nobody has an angel appear to them. You got lucky. You have a neurotic edge or whatever, or you have a neuroses and so on. So we explain the deep meanings of things, and we look for a therapeutic answer as opposed to a spiritual answer. And slowly in Western culture, it's triumphed. Slowly it's triumphed where this becomes the norm. The churches are pushed to the side. As Robertson Davies used to say, the new priest doesn't wear an alb and stole. The new priest wears a lab coat and tells you exactly what the truth is. The new priest doesn't stand by an altar, he stands in a laboratory, writes not in some theological journal, they write in some journal of medicine coming out of Harvard or Yale, or some technological magazine. It says, the new priestly vestments are a lab coat. This is the person who deals the truth. Not, that's the triumph of the therapeutic. It's a different set of symbols, okay? Bloom, very interestingly, who was a complete secularist, so it's not the Roman Catholic Church thing, and Bloom particularly zeroes in one thing. He says, it's the death of chastity. He said, and not just sexual chastity. He said, more than anything else in American culture that has led to the closing of our minds. And he said, for him, chastity isn't so much even a sexual thing, although it pertains to that. He said, it's the way we experience things with a certain lack of transcendence and irreverence and so on, which he got out of Plato, we get out of religious traditions, And he said, he taught for some years at the University of Chicago, and he says, I look at 19 and 20-year-old kids, and he said, they're erotically lame. He said, their eros has gone lame because they've never had any chastity in their life. And he's not just talking about sexuality, he's talking about just prematurity and rushed experience of all kinds. Kids grow up today real fast. So he said it's no accident by the time they get to be 20 years old, been there, done it. There's a loss of enchantment. If you look at the works of the young Catholic, I don't think so young anymore, he was young when he started writing, but Thomas More, who was a pupil of James Hillman, and his earlier books, re-enchantment of the soul, soul mates, and so on. That's kind of been his life's work. He said, we need to re-enchant the soul. The soul has gone flat. Or Bloom said it's gone erotically lame. But a lot of that is through language, through just symbols that shrink.